Today, I mean, obviously, language is an important element of human identity, and throughout the history of humankind, there's a long tradition of governments, authorities, people trying to control the language of others. And today I'm going to talk specifically about and how language actually is an important, a major element of conflict. And you may be aware that we are now in the 5th day of rioting in the streets of Barcelona as a result of the push or resistance to autonomy, independence, and language plays a critical, absolutely critical, and has played a critical role in that particular battle or struggle, however you wish to word it, in Catalonia. And there is, in fact, a very long history of language conflict in Europe. We have it in Ukraine today. We have it in Spain, as I just pointed out. Long history of language conflict in France against language minorities, in the UK as well. Actually, we're not very much aware of it, but if you follow news in Wales, you'll find frequent agitations, demonstrations, actions to support the Welsh language against imposition of English, against big business, outside big business that seems to not want to follow the rules, even though there are laws and rules in place in Wales for big business, and they don't seem to understand that they have obligations as well. In the European context in particular, one of the big drivers for language conflict, and it's not always the case that there's language conflict, and in many parts of Europe we have centuries of linguistic coexistence without too many problems, but a particular driver in the European context was the rise of the concept of the nation state. That is, countries should exist entirely within their borders, and within their borders everybody should be the same. Everyone should speak exactly the same language, everyone should have exactly the same identity, complete the same education, etc., etc., etc. Because anything other than that is too messy for a nation to exist, and that's been one of the tensions in Europe for a long, long time. And today I'm going to look specifically at 2 case studies, Italy and Belgium, because they show interesting differences, both in fact but also in outcomes. It shows you how different countries try and deal with or not deal with linguistic conflict. So in the case of Italy, Italy has a long history of linguistic conflict. It's much less than used to be the case, but one of the big drivers is that beautiful location there on the left that you can see. That is the Brenner Pass, Brennero. And if you control that, you control access between north and south across the Alps. It's the main access, it's the lowest entry point over the mountains between Germanic north and the Latin south. And basically the train line that goes from Rome through Verona into Austria, into Germany, goes through that pass. It's strategically very, very important, and it was under Austrian control for many centuries. And Austria, of course, was the epicenter of a multilingual, multi-ethnic empire that many of us surprisingly hark back to today as a period of peaceful coexistence. Wasn't necessarily the case. In fact, there was a lot of linguistic conflict and ethnic conflicts in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But if you look at the map on the right, you can see that those black bits are the bits that France and the United Kingdom promised Italy if Italy would swap sides during World War I. At the outset of World War I, Italy was actually allied to Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but stood out of the war and stayed neutral, and it actually negotiated, it was looking for better terms. And what the Austrians and the Germans offered was not as good as what the French and the Brits offered. And they offered all of those black bits. And that black bit at the top that you can see, it looks almost like a diamond, that is the Brenner Pass. And actually it's right in that middle of that black bit. The bit, this bottom half of that large diamond is in what is in Italy today. And Italy got all of those, actually got most of those black bits, but critically got that black bit at the top. It didn't hold on to the rest, it lost the rest after World War II, but it got to keep that bit at the top. There's one little problem. World War I ended in 1918. Italy got those various bits, However, Italy itself was in turmoil, and by 1922, Mussolini and the fascists took over. And this was an ultra-nationalistic project. This really was the nation state. And Mussolini was determined to make sure that every single person living within the borders of Italy was an Italian speaker with an Italian surname, devoted to the Italian state, in Italian in every possible way. The only problem was that in taking on these bits and pieces, people entered Italy who were not Italian in any way. And in the case of the South Tyrol, that area in the north, they ended up with hundreds of thousands of German-speaking Austrians who did not want to be in Italy. They were just pawns in this game. So what do you do with people who don't want to be there and people that you don't necessarily want? Mussolini was actually pragmatic, if you want to say that. He decided, well, we'll keep the people, but we will transform them. And very quickly, the human rights of these minorities, not just the Germans, but Slovenes and Croats elsewhere, were systematically eliminated. The linguistic rights were eliminated. There was forced assimilation, Italianization. They were all required to Italianize their surnames, and they were forced to learn Italian through the medium of Italian exclusively in schools. There was a lot of resistance in the South Tyrol, Alto Adige. It was renamed. All the place names were renamed. Everything was redone. It's quite an extraordinary process, and there was a lot of complicit activity on the part of linguists who supported this project. Very well-known Italian linguists who helped to support this project. So he then also brought in tens of thousands of Italians from the south to repopulate the area, to industrialize, etc., to turn this whole area south. And by the 1930s, the late 1930s, Mussolini and Hitler decided that they would resolve this problem forever, and they came up with the infamous option, and in which case the German-speaking population of South Tyrol had to decide whether they would leave or they would stay. And this was agreed by Germany and Italy. If they stayed on condition that they became fully Italian, renounced all of their linguistic cultural rights. And in fact, 80% of the German speakers did agree to do this, and they started leaving, and then of course events changed during World War II, and by the end of World War II they came back. Of course, fascism was gone, Nazism was gone, but we have a problem. We have a return to democracy in Italy, and we have an agreement between Italy and Austria. You can see by the dates, and this is very Italian, it took a long time to get things sorted. So the Italians, although they agreed to this, because remember the Italians were ambiguous victors in World War II because they were on the wrong side to start with and then swapped sides and ended up on the right side, but still it wasn't a clean victory. It wasn't until 1972, so you can see decades later, that the agreement was ratified, and it took another 20 years before the protector of the German speakers in the South Tyrol agreed that the rights and the conditions supporting the German speakers in South Tyrol were fully protected and the conflict was over. It actually took a long, long time. And it wasn't a peaceful process. It was actually a very difficult one. The Italian state was very resistant to accepting change, particularly this type of change. It's not used to recognizing the rights of non-Italians. It's a very different conceptualization of the world for the Italian state. And it was actually quite brutal. And there were 361 terrorist attacks. There were 21 killed, mostly police officers and military, by German speakers seeking secession from Italy, ideally independence or being returned to Austria. That was the dream. And really you can see that Italy is dragged kicking and screaming to some peaceable agreement. So what is the solution? Eventually, actually, it works out very well, and surprisingly, this is one of the contexts where the minority actually ends up doing far better than the majority. This is really quite surprising. And you can see this is the South Tyrol, the Tyrol, how it's split up. The bits that are in pink were the bits that stayed in Austria. The bit in orange is the German majority area, and the bit in blue was the bit that was always Italian-speaking. It's called Trent or Trent, and that was never not contentious. It was the bit in orange that was always contentious. And so what we have now is a political solution, and it works for a whole series of reasons. One is that it's incredibly generous financially. They keep most of their taxes. In fact, they keep more than their taxes. So they keep 100% of their income tax, which is quite unusual in most countries. And there is complete official public bilingualism. This took a long time to achieve, and this is really the only solution, so that anywhere you are in, certainly the orange bit, it's fully officially bilingual. Your private sphere is something else, but in the public sphere, it's fully bilingual. But there are checks and balances in place. And these are things that the German-speaking minority insisted upon. They have a linguistic census every 10 years, and you have to identify yourself as German speaker, Italian speaker, or if you're not from there, as other. But you cannot identify yourself as bi-ethnic. It is actually not allowed by law. And that legal requirement has important implications for everything, because that statistic every 10 years determines everything for the next 10 years. There are only one language of medium in schools. There is one little bilingual program run by some nuns with about 50 students, but that is considered to be so radical, so risky to the project that it's actually not encouraged by the state, because it's all about numbers. And what happens is in that orange bit that the Germans are about 65% of the population. It's stabilized for a few, and the Germans were so adamant on this because they were panicked that the proportion of German speakers continue to decline. Originally, in 1920, the proportion of German speakers was 98%. It dipped as low as 60%, and it's now stabilized at about 65%. Ironically, the Italian speakers are leaving or are re-identifying as German speakers. But why would they do that? That's a very interesting question. It just shows you people can be pragmatic if they wish to be. And the reason is that there is no majority government. Government is shared across ethnic lines, as is the whole public sector. It is quoted, so that all jobs are decided by a language quota. Even though everyone is to work in the public sector, you have to be officially recognised as bilingual, even though you're ethno-linguistically have only one identity. And you have these little things that we call il patentino, the little license that confirms that you have sat the official language exams. So that all jobs are quoted, and this is a way of maintaining balance and keeping everyone happy. It's so tight that actually if you can't find someone in your quota, because of staff shortage or whatever, that job doesn't get filled. So the post office in this area is notorious for being very slow because they can't get enough postal workers who are German speaking, for instance. That gives you an idea. But we have finally relative peace here. It's quite a complicated situation, but it's now recognised as being the best case example of achieving some kind of linguistic harmony. It's not perfect, and there are lots of tensions, and there are very interesting strategies that are used by the different groups in terms of maintaining linguistic power. Belgium is a little bit of a different case. You can see the map there. Hopefully you can identify Belgium there. It sits on the English Channel between France, Netherlands, and Germany. The name is an artificial name. It didn't exist until the 19th century, but they had to find a name, and they went back to ancient Roman times. And it straddles the Germanic Latin/Romance divide, and that's a big problem. And it is, as a result, both culturally and linguistically divided. And it has the unfortunate geographical circumstance of being stuck right in the middle. And it's the kind of place, it was actually, according to many historians, created partly to separate Germany and France, keep them apart. If they weren't in direct contact, we'd have more peace. Unfortunately, neither side saw that. the poor Belgians, the Belgian wanted to stay out of the wars. The poor Belgians, despite this notion, this didn't work in either First World War or Second World War. So this is the basic orientation, and you can see this is Belgium in the white, and you can see this kind of wriggly line in the middle. That's the split between the Dutch-speaking north and the French-speaking south. It's actually not quite perfect, we'll see, because there's something that gets overlooked. The country is officially trilingual. Most people don't know this. It's Dutch, officially Dutch, French, and as well as German-speaking. People don't realise this. The German-speaking minority is tiny. It's 1%, and you may not know that our finance minister in this country is actually from German-speaking Belgium. He's multilingual, he speaks about 5 languages. All right, so where does it come from? Belgium is a late arrival, relatively late arrival in Western history, Western Europe. It's actually the result of an uprising against the Dutch, mainly to do with religion, because the Belgians are overwhelmingly Catholic. The Dutch are split between Catholicism and Protestantism. And also for historical reasons, it was the bit that was controlled by the Spanish and the Austrians for centuries, so never fully integrated into the Dutch world. And of course, a large part of it is French-speaking. So there's a revolution, 1831, a monarchy is established, and they fight off the Dutch until 1839. And here we go, that's the official motto, strength through unity. You'll see this is somewhat ironic. All right, so it has geographical disunity, political geographical disunity. It also has the problem it doesn't have a constant history. It's a relatively recent creation, and it has a lack of narrative continuity. You can't tell a story that goes back centuries or thousands of years because it simply doesn't have that unified history, and that's been a big problem. So when it was created, they spent a lot of time creating a history, building monuments, etc., to show that we are one country. But the big problem is it has 2 major language groups, the Dutch-speaking Flemish in the north and the French-speaking Walloons, forced into a country where the power, everything that is power, wants to speak French because that is the natural way of things. You may not be aware that until the Russian Revolution, most royal courts actually spoke French as their first language, if not their second language. You may not be aware that Queen Elizabeth actually, our Queen, actually speaks quite good French. If you go on YouTube, you'll see her talking to the French president. What is she talking about? The weather, of course. All right, so, and you get there's also, apart from the linguistic divide, you get an important cultural and economic divide. The north is traditionally ultra-Catholic, economically very poor, very rural, and considered obviously to be backward. The south is rich, it's got industry, it's got coal mines, it's got steel mines in the 19th century and the early 20th century. This is worth a lot. And what you get is super resentment, actually on both sides, about language issues, and super sensitivity on both sides as well. Because the French do not want to cede linguistic power, and the Dutch, the Flemish, want access to linguistic power, but not on French-speaking terms. So what is the solution? This has taken a long time. There's some amazing stuff. Some of the stories, I'll just give you some anecdotes, but it is actually against Belgian law to hold a census on language. The last linguistic census was in the 1960s, and it took them 30 years to get over that. And what they've done is they've come up with an entirely different solution. So whereas in Italy, they've come up with the solution of full official bilingualism on the same territory so that any Italian and German speaker can use Italian or German with officialdom. In Belgium, there's a totally different solution. It is one language, one territory. Your language does not travel with you. And this was originally, ironically, the Dutch-speaking Flemish are the big protectors of this, although originally it was the French speakers' solution because they did not, under any circumstances, want to be forced to learn Dutch. That was beneath them. So what we have is the solution. The yellow bit is exclusively officially Dutch-speaking. The red bit is officially exclusively French-speaking. You have no rights in French-speaking Belgium to use Dutch or to expect any services in Dutch, and vice versa. And the little blue bit on the end, 1% of the population is officially German-speaking. There are also excellent French speakers as well, and they're so marginal no one ever talks about them. And what you have is you have complete, it's quite remarkable, with the exception of that little orange bit. Does anyone know what the orange bit is? The little circle, that's Brussels. That is the one officially bilingual part of Belgium. And that's 80% French-speaking, 20% Dutch-speaking. But it was originally 100% Dutch-speaking until Belgium was established. And that's one of the things that sticks in the craw of Flemish nationalists. Okay, sure. And so what happens is, there are some amazing stories. For instance, there are French speakers who live on the Flemish side near the Brussels border. They're not allowed to hold religious services in French. They must. So she's talking about her father who dies, and the father's funeral, even though they're exclusively French-speaking, it can only be done in Dutch. They're not allowed actually to do them in French. And so you get a lot of crazy things happening. So for instance, if you catch the train from Antwerp to Charleroi, the announcements on the train change linguistically. So they will exclusively be in Dutch. Then as you approach Brussels, they will be in Dutch and French. As you leave Brussels, they will be in Dutch again for a very short time, and then they will be French. So in the metro itself, when they established the metro, they knew that language was a problem. So for a long time, they had music without songs, without words. Then they realized that they wanted to have words, but it was going to be problematic to have Dutch or French. So they actually paid a company to select songs. And so for a long time, the songs, there was a language quota. And the language quota was 70% English, 15% Italian, and 15% Spanish. That was the language quota. Then a few years ago, they decided, maybe we could play some French or Dutch songs. And they did that for a little while until there was such a ruckus because Flemish nationalists said, there are more French songs than there are Dutch songs. So instantaneously, they banned all French and Dutch songs on the metro. And they now play exclusively English, Italian, and Spanish. I always wondered why Italian pop singers were really popular in Belgium. And now I know because they have access to a population. So, and that's absolutely true. And in the Eurovision Song Contest, crazy, it's split every year. One year the French Belgians prepare the song, the next year it's the Dutch Belgians. They've sent songs with artificial language, and increasingly in the last few years, and they came second once with that, quite remarkable, and increasingly now they send the songs in English exclusively. And they had, as a result of language issues, they have the world record for the longest period of time without a national government, 541 days. They could not sort out the language issues. And surprisingly, the country still operated. And actually at the moment, as a result of ethno-linguistic tensions, they have no government in Belgium at the moment. They're completely used to this. But what happens is you end up, the solution is each time to resolve the crisis, is you end up with increasing the autonomy of the regions, and you end up with a national state that doesn't really exist anymore. But what keeps it together? What keeps it together? And the one thing, we have to be lucky, that keeps the country together is Brussels. Because Brussels actually functions like one of those clips on an item of clothing, one of those press studs. Because that's the thing that keeps the country together, because it would have to leave, if the country split in two, it would go with the French south, because it's overwhelmingly French-speaking, but the Flemish would never, ever cede a centimetre of Brussels, because it is traditionally in Flanders. So we have to ironically be grateful for that. But you can see we have two very different solutions to problems of language conflict. Thank you.